Hope everything in your world is fine and dandy. I passed a kidney stone earlier. I've been waiting for this. Not the kidney stone. Well, kinda. But these. This should be fun, because I'm working on some very old Gibson dreadnoughts. Yes, sir. 1940s, post-war, slope-shouldered beauties. I think some of you know that I have a fondness for small-bodied Martin guitars, but when it comes to dreadnought-sized instruments, I think I'm a fan of Gibsons. Why? Who knows? By most measurable standards, the craftsmanship in a Martin at this time was probably 20 to 30% better than the Gibson line. But there's a certain allure to these, though. They've got the slightly shorter scale, smaller radius on the fretboard, significantly different neck profile, less fastidious shaping work on the braces. But they've also got that sunburst finish, which in itself is probably a nod to keeping costs down as much as beauty, because you don't have to be so picky when you're making them with sunbursts. You can get away with like filler around the heel and some gaps around the binding. You can hide a whole lot under a sunburst. Maybe use wood that's, got some funny grain in it or something, or some dark streaks that you couldn't put on a blonde guitar. So I'm going to call this part one of an I don't know how long sequence of videos about these things, because there's a bunch of work to do, and there's 3 of them actually, and we'll get into it. Talking about sunburst and the lacquer itself that Gibson used, it degrades in a very different way from the stuff that Martin was putting on their guitars. It's almost always checked and crackled. In the wrong conditions, it'll flake right off. There's something beautiful about its decrepitude, though, in some cases. Not always. But usually it ages in this really kind of interesting way. What's the difference between these guitars? I've got a Southern Jumbo over here. This is the J45. There's not a whole lot of difference, really, beyond basic cosmetics. The J45 is the so-called workhorse of the Gibson line, built for business. Not a lot of bling on it. Not very much extra labor involved in its decoration. It was preceded in the 1930s by a couple of dreadnought-sized models. There was the original Jumbo and the J35. Stylistically, very similar guitars. They had different shaped pickguards. They had small, straight bridges. And many of the J35s were finished in natural rather than sunburst. On the inside, those earlier slope-shouldered dreadnoughts, they had very light scalloped bracing, which is a feature that was kind of done away with for the J45. I think they were probably getting too many guitars coming back for warranty repair, because we're in that era where people were sort of using larger diameter strings and really sort of chugging away doing hard and fast country music and that kind of stuff. So, we're not delicately strumming anymore. People are breaking these. The J45 was introduced in 1942. It cost $45 without a case. The US had entered the war at that point, of course, so a lot of the premium quality spruce was going into aircraft and other vehicles. A lot of the workforce was shifting over into military production too, or getting into uniform. So Gibson started hiring women to work in their assembly plant for the first time. There's lots of variation within the first couple of years of the J45. By 1946, when this one was made, it was pretty much solidified. This is the iconic guitar that it would become. At the same time, they decided to release a very slightly fancier model called the Southern Jumbo, the SJ, sometimes referred to as the Southerner Jumbo in some literature of the time. Rather than plain dots on the fretboard, these have the split parallelogram inlays in pearloid. It's also got multi-line purfling and an extra fancy purfling ring around the sound hole as well. I suppose they thought the Southern man required a little extra pearl on his guitar. Other than that, very similar. After the war, they added the white binding to the fingerboard as well. Materials in these guitars are very similar, of course. They both have mahogany back and sides. The tops are spruce. Assuming that is Adirondack or red spruce. It has fairly wide grain on the SJ. The J45 has much tighter grain For about the last 30 years or so, the standard reference for learning about this stuff has been a book called Gibson's Fabulous Flat-Top Guitars, written by Eldon Whitford, David Vinopal, and our friend in repair, Dan Erlewine. I don't actually own a copy of that book. I used to take it out of the library. I think they probably sold it one of those library book sales where someone bought it for like 25 cents. Grown. Anyway, I don't have a copy, but it's a good one. I used to read it a lot. And yes, these are all player's grade. They've had various modifications over the years. The SJ is missing a guard. We're going to make a new one. Bridges. Is that the original bridge? Don't know. Definitely not the original bridge on the 45. That looks like a 1970s replacement. In 1946, this would not have had a belly bridge. It would have been straight across. And the owner and I have been discussing whether or not we want to put one of those back on this guitar and how cleanly I can do it. The adjustable saddle is, well, it didn't show up for another 10 years. So this is not the original bridge. Don't know if that's the original pickguard, but it's the right shape, which is nice. And of course there's been finish repair and that sort of thing. What do you expect? A pristine example of one of these is really, really expensive. So almost all of the ones that you can buy on the market for under $10,000 look kind of like this. And then there is this one. This is also an SJ. It's from the same year as the J45. This is a 1946 instrument, making it 5 years younger than that one. And pretty unrecognizable, right? I'm sure you'd agree that certain decisions were made. So we're going to try to reverse some of those decisions. Double pickguards? Who knows what that's hiding? But whatever's under there is probably less offensive. There was a period in the late 1950s when country and rockabilly players went kind of wild with the whole custom pickguard thing. There was a guy in Nashville who was doing them, like great, big, all kinds of crazy stuff. The bigger the better, basically. I think maybe the Everleys were the ones who kind of started the craze, but other people ran with it. A whole lot of Martins ended up with, like, half the soundboard obscured by thick plastic. Here's a shot of Johnny Cash with Batman's guitar. So yeah, this was stripped back and front. It's actually got a skunk stripe, which is kind of interesting. And it's got a pickup system in it, or had. There are vestiges of screw holes that have been plugged around the sound hole and other weird stuff there. And it's got a couple of knobs. Knobs are going to come out. We'll plug that up. And these are really honkin' big pickguards. I mean, they're really thick. Probably like 3/32 of an inch, 100 thousandths, 2.5 millimeters thick. That's a lot of plastic to put on the top of your guitar. Now, in terms of the actual refinish, it's not bad. It was pretty good work. It's cleanly done. Absolutely straight clear. The pickguards are pretty inexcusable, but really it's the bridge that throws it for me. It's gonna stick in my craw, because it's probably gonna cause me more work than anything else on the guitar. Because in 1946, these would have had straight bridges with no belly on them. A couple of years later, they introduced the reverse belly bridge, like this SJ. I don't think that's an original one either, but it's similar to that. For some reason, they decided to put a standard Martin-style belly bridge where the belly's on this side. And that makes it look like a 1970s J45, which is pretty inexcusable. You know, if you're going to go to all the trouble of making a new bridge and installing it, why not just do the belly on that side? I suspect they probably even salvaged these pearl dots from the original guitar and stuck them in here to go in the original screw holes, which, you know, it's even got a through saddle. So that's a choice that I think could have been made with more sensitivity. So I'm documenting the usual measurements. A couple of these are going to have the bridge pulled off. So, you know, when you're doing a neck reset, it really helps to have the bridge that you'll be using in place on the guitar, so you can get a feel for how the neck angle relates to it. And got to know things like action and relief and all the usual stuff. And during this examination process, I'm also taking note of damage I see and stuff that might come back to haunt me later on. On this SJ, Looking at the heel, I see this circular mark and what appears to be another one there. And I'm willing to bet that this missing portion is part of another such mark, which leads me to believe that someone tried to push this heel off at some point. And bearing that out, you can see this network of crazing on the heel here. I've mentioned this before, but if the neck isn't going to come off and you keep pushing on it, you can actually compress it to the point where the wood will buckle under pressure. Now the lacquer, of course, can't do that, and you end up with this striated effect, not unlike what you see in certain metamorphic rock strata that have been under pressure and then rebounded. So it's possible that someone tried to take the neck off and couldn't, or maybe it was just a real struggle. And looking at the back, there are several repaired cracks. I think I've seen this repair person's work before, because the cracks have some kind of material in them that is humped up at the seam. There's been no attempt to make it level with the rest of the surface. It's raised, which is interesting. There's also this on the treble side. There's a line that cuts vertically through the side. There are cracks extending from it that have been glued previously, but it's possible that a portion of the side was actually damaged and replaced. Here's a good example of that characteristic sitar-like sound I sometimes mention when I refer to there not being enough break angle for the strings. You get this high harmonic overtone. Early 50s gold decal. Replacement tuners. I don't hate them. They're fine. The black-white plastic purfling used for the rosette often cracks in one or more locations, especially if there's been a fingerboard crack and the neck has started to push down towards the bridge. I'm just seeing one there that doesn't seem to have been repaired at any point in the past, so we're just going to check really carefully to make sure that this area is shored up, because that's a really dangerous spot. If there are fingerboard cracks on either side, this is just sort of flopping loose in the wind and succumbs to the tension of the strings, and some disastrous effects happen, so we want to make sure that's good and secure. So the original pickguard is long gone, but fascinatingly, there is the ghostly image of a replacement that was put on sometime that looked nothing like the originals. In fact, it's got some points and stuff up here that are sort of like the one on that Johnny Cash photo. Some history there. The really fun thing is, because this is an SJ from 1951, we get to use a material that completely foreign to any other 1950s Gibsons. Something that they had done away with for most of the 1940s, and that is the fire stripe pickguard material. This is a classic design feature of the 1930s. Small body flat tops, some of them, late 30s. Really beautiful stuff, iconic, and only good, in this case, for guitars made in 1951. So that's pretty cool. So the question arises, how do we handle anachronistic bridges on these old guitars? Because it's very common. Oftentimes they would split, or they would just come off repeatedly and someone would throw in a towel, someone would make a new one. Repair people in the past didn't have to work with the burden of maintaining originality that we do today. And the other thing is, many times those people didn't have access to the reams of photos and other documentation that's at our fingertips now. If they only saw one or two late 40s Gibsons in a year, how would they know what the bridge is supposed to look like if they lost the original? Beyond what they could see in some grainy photos in a book, taken from a distance. Now, I happen to live about 45 minutes from Folkway Music, which is home base for Mark Stutman, who is one of the most knowledgeable repair people where pre-war Gibson flat tops are concerned. He works on all the important examples. He knows them inside and out and upside down. So when Folkway puts photos and descriptions up on their website, I can trust that they're going to be right. You know, and the descriptions will tell me if they're not, versus something you might find on Reverb by a fly-by-night seller who doesn't really know what he's got, or maybe just cuts and pastes descriptions he found in other ads. I think if you deal with these guitars long enough, you start to develop a kind of sense where you look at a bridge, and maybe it's not even strictly a visual thing. It's more like, it's like a feel, right? The fine points become super obvious. Now the bridge on this SJ, it's a functional bridge. Belly's on the side that you would expect it to be on. The shape is very similar to what we expect, but it's the little things, like the pearl dots that hide the screw holes going through to the bridge pad. They're not in line with the bridge pin holes. And stuff like, well, the swoop down from the main body of the bridge to the wing. On the genuine article, that is a definite radius of a particular diameter that stops at a specific distance from the plug holes. You can try and fudge it freehand with a belt sander, but it's never going to look right to someone who spends a whole lot of time looking at these things and thinking about it. Most people won't care. And on a guitar in this case, which is, you know, in this condition, whatever. On a collector's guitar, though, people start with the ruler and they measure that stuff and they want to know that that's the original bridge, because it could mean thousands and thousands of dollars in terms of the sale. So the question continues, does it have to look original in a deceptive way? On a guitar of this vintage with this amount of play wear, how close does it need to be before we feel compelled to pull it off because it's not right enough? And in doing that, by pulling it off, are we maybe introducing the opportunity for soundboard damage, finish damage, other problems that might arise through that procedure? I'll say, I think the character of this bridge is in keeping with the guitar. I'm not offended by it. The one thing that I find irksome is the blind saddle slot. It doesn't continue through to the wing. And in this case, when we're going to be doing a neck reset and making a new saddle anyway, I'll keep the bridge, but I'll take that opportunity to lengthen the slot. And that will do something visually to reconcile the bridge with the era this guitar was made. Similarly, on this SJ, if I have the opportunity to shade the top and spray a burst on it to maybe cover up some sins that are going on under the pickguards, the bridge needs to come off the guitar anyway to do that properly. So why wouldn't I take the opportunity to make something that looks like it's from 1946 rather than keeping this? Again, we're talking about cultural icons here. These are not just strictly machines for making music at a certain point, you know. And that's something everyone has to come to terms with if you're into repair and reconstruction of these old guitars. What responsibility is there to make this visually right and identifiable as made in the year it was produced, rather than just holding on to the fact that this is a decent bridge that will do its job just fine? Things to consider. This earlier stripped SJ has had a neck reset. There's some evidence there. It's nice that they put it on the side of the neck that faces away from the player. So the action is pretty good on this guitar. It's actually too low at this point on the treble side, just over 3/64. Here's an example of the post-war Gibson script logo, which they used in the latter half of 1940s for a short time before they went to the block letters that most of us would consider the classic design that we all know and love. Earlier they had what we call the banner years, where there was a small banner on the headstock as well. Only a Gibson is good enough. Then they went to this design. This has rather abysmal, inexpensive tuners on it, which I believe we will replace with something more in keeping. Interesting, rather than pearloid like we see in the 1950s example, this one has what seems to be genuine mother of pearl for the block inlays. Whoever did the refinishing on this decided to incorporate a stinger, which is this sort of pointy design. There are factory examples of this, but it's often used as a repair technique to hide broken headstock. If there was a break, it's not really telegraphing through the lacquer. I don't know. And of course they used what we call the skunk stripe. Don't know how many factory stripes we see on the back of the neck. You do see them on the body, sometimes even on the top in sunbursted affected guitars. Usually it's a little narrower than this. So, I mean, it's a decorative motif, basically. I don't think I've ever seen one that comes down over the heel. I want to be careful pulling the knobs off, because these are, of course, only supported by 1/8 of an inch of soundboard wood. Hopefully it hasn't been sanded too thin. Although, to be honest, this is a fairly heavy feeling guitar in comparison to the J45. These were import pots without a decipherable date code on them, but judging from the state of them and the input jack, I'm guessing these were installed at least 40 and maybe even 50 years ago. Now on to the task of pulling off the pick guards with gentle prying from the palette knife. Some areas were more stubborn than others, depending on how well the adhesive was sticking to the lacquer and whether the lacquer was sticking to the soundboard, but it came off reasonably clean. The treble side still had some bare wood from under the original guard, which is cool but also annoying because the adhesive will have sunk into the wood and there are some slight areas of damage as well. Pretty happy though. Yeah, this stuff is more than 80 thousandths thick. More than 2 millimeters. Quick look inside to see that all the usual things are happening. This 1946 SJ has scalloped braces. I don't know how common that is. I can see that only one of the retaining screws seems to be in place there on the base side. So I'll go ahead and steam the pearl dot, which is hiding the head of the screw. With some gentle prying, that comes free. I can remove the screw. I got worried and thought maybe there was something on the other side, just in case I should take that one out, and it's a good thing I did because it was hiding a much shorter screw. So then I had to remove the bridge using my little heating pad here. This was some tenacious adhesive. Came off reasonably clean, but the surface is pretty rough. With some experimentation, I've discovered that the tapered plug cutter I use, called a snug plug cutter, actually matches up very nicely with the angle created by my cello end pin reamer. So I'll just clean up the margins of the jack hole, cut a plug of mahogany, and glue that in. I'll do the same thing on the soundboard as well. I found a piece of spruce with grain that is pretty close to what we're looking for. Ream those out and put those in as well. I'm going to end this video here so I can recover a bit, and in part 2 we'll get into some real heavy-duty work. So I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching.